afternoon, everyone. My name is Philip Ivanov. I'm the CEO of Asia Society Australia. Welcome to Asia Society and welcome to today's very special event celebrating the launch of the project on Southeast Asia and COVID-19, which is an initiative of the Asia Society Policy Institute and Asia Society Australia. Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, from the land of Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri peoples of the East Kulin Nation. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or First Nations people joining our webcast today. This new project presents a series of reflections on Southeast Asia and the COVID-19 pandemic through essays and video commentaries from experts. Over the course of the project, we will examine the pandemic's effect on Southeast Asia, on its politics and society, on its economy, regional cohesion, and external relations. We'll also try to suggest ways in which Southeast Asia's partners can respond to developments in the region and support Southeast Asia's economic recovery and long-term resilience and sovereignty. I would like to acknowledge the support for this project of the Australia-ASEAN Council at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and also the Victorian Government support for our Policy Institute's presence here in Australia. So today at this event, we'll take a look at the course of the pandemic in Southeast Asia and its effects on the region's politics, society, and external relations. So before we hear from our experts and speakers, let me quickly go through today's proceedings. We'll have a 20-minute discussion with our panel, and we'll move to Q&A. You can submit your questions through the YouTube chat box at any time. You can, of course, access the Southeast Asia and COVID-19 website, which includes the project's first two essays, as well as video commentaries from experts using the link in the chat box. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. First of all, Richard Maude, who's Senior Fellow of the Asia Society Policy Institute, as well as Executive Director for Policy at Asia Society Australia, who is a project leader and author. Joining him are the project contributors, Professor Tikki, Visiting Professor at National University of Singapore, and Dr. Huong, Senior Analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Please visit our website and read their full biographies. I'm sure our speakers are familiar to you. And of course, welcome and thank you all for joining us today. Let me start with you, Richard. Tell us a little bit about Southeast Asia and the COVID-19 project and what's behind it.
Thanks, Philip. Well, of course, as we all know that global media coverage on the pandemic really saturates our news and a great deal of analysis. And of course, it's focused very heavily on the United States, on China, and at the moment on Europe, on the second waves that many European countries are struggling with. Now, Southeast Asia is not invisible in all of that by any means, but it certainly does receive less attention. Yet this is an economically important region. It also sits somewhat precariously at the crossroads of a geopolitically changing Asia and a world of much sharper US-China competition. So we really wanted to illuminate some of the stories from Southeast Asia as it grapples with the pandemic. And as you mentioned, over coming weeks, we're going to cover 6 themes: health, politics, economics and trade, geopolitics and regionalism. And I'm doing some of this analysis, but I'm delighted that we're also going to have a diversity of voices in the project, including, of course, from Tikki and Huong, who join us here today. You know, we are hoping, as you said, not just to offer analysis and an assessment of what's happening on the region, but also some thoughts about policy options for the region and for the region's partners. And like you, I just want to say again that we're very pleased to be partnering with the Australia-ASEAN Council in this work.
Thank you, Richard. I might go to Professor Pan. What is the current state of play of the COVID-19 pandemic in Southeast Asia? How has the region fared compared with other parts of the world?
Thank you, Philip, and welcome everyone. I would say that in overall terms, the region is faring pretty well compared to the rest of the world, except perhaps for maybe two or three countries in the region. I'm referring to Indonesia, Philippines, and perhaps more recently, Myanmar. But overall, I think in the context of numbers, we have more than 40 million cases of COVID globally with about 1.1 million deaths. The ASEAN region, in that sort of global context, is only about around 2% of those total cases and total deaths, whereas the ASEAN population is about nearly 9% of the total world population. So proportionately, I would say the region's faring pretty well, with the exception of those three countries.
And what is your prediction, or what is the outlook for Indonesia and Philippines? Will they get the pandemic under control? And also, how confident are you about Myanmar?
Yeah, I think the situation from what I've seen is likely to continue to remain quite serious in Indonesia and in the Philippines, as well as probably a bit early to predict what might happen in Myanmar. But other countries, aside from those three, are probably having to be prepared for localized clusters of outbreaks. But going back to your question on Indonesia and the Philippines, and this relates to policy options that Richard mentioned before. And I think to overcome what they're going through at the moment, they need to really deal with essentially five key challenges and the problems that have led them to come to this very serious situation. And firstly, that's sort of a delayed and uncoordinated response, especially between federal and the provincial governments, given the archipelagic nature of those two countries. Secondly, the low priority given to surveillance, testing, tracing, treatment. Thirdly, the failure to restrict large movements of people. You recall that in March, the Philippines failed to stop the movement of 16 million people from Manila out to the provinces. And Indonesia, during the Eid holidays, once again, the movement of people, across the country to celebrate the holidays. So that's the third issue. The fourth is premature easing of restrictions, which we've seen happen in both of those countries. And finally, the lack of the ability to protect frontline health workers, which is really tragic in terms of the numbers of doctors and nurses that have died in those two countries. So those are the things that they have to overcome. They need effective policy, strong leadership in order to overcome the very serious situation at the moment.
Thank you. And to Huong, you've kindly agreed to contribute some thoughts for this project on geopolitics. And we know that Southeast Asia is sort of the epicenter of the geopolitical competition in Asia in some way. How do you see the pandemic affecting Southeast Asia's geopolitics? And following from that question, does the pandemic change in any fundamental way the structure of power in Southeast Asia and the competition between China and the United States?
Thank you, Philip, and thank you to Richard and the Asia Society Australia to invite me to contribute to this very important project. I've long been advocate to pay more attention to Southeast Asia, especially with a number of Indo-Pacific strategies that in rhetoric put Southeast Asia at this center. I'm glad that we have more attention to this very diverse region, as we'll try to explore that with this essays, number of essays and projects in the projects. I think the COVID has a number of factors that it will influence the region. It will shape as the region comes out from the pandemic. And as Professor Tikki said, there are different reactions and different responses that will really shape the different responses. So it is a reminder that this is not a unified region and it will not come out on equal terms, equal timeline. And therefore, their responses to the changing geopolitics will be very different as well. And we see, there is a lot of thinking about the COVID pandemic as accelerator of pre-existing trends pre-COVID. But I think to add to that, really what happens during COVID, it's in very much accelerated pace as well. Yes, the trends have existed before the COVID, and yes, COVID will accentuate that, but also in many ways deepen and deteriorate, bring out probably more challenges than opportunities. So there are a number of ways to look at the COVID. First, how individual countries respond and whether they are in the position to defend their legitimacy, something that Richard probably will be talking about in terms of politics, but that also affects how they respond to the geopolitical trends. There would be an issue, of course, with governance domestically. So the COVID also exposed a lot of challenges and weaknesses that are really perennial across a number of countries in Southeast Asia, and we can get to that in a moment as well. And then there's an issue of economics and economic trajectory, whether how hardly the COVID pandemic will hit the countries, how they will recover, and that will also determine their position of power, their power and how they come out of it. And thirdly, I would say the external, fourthly, the external factors, how they interact with external powers, primarily the great power competition between the US and China. How do they react and respond to US and China in particular? How do they see countries like US and China? And of course, other countries such as Japan, Australia, and a number of other countries, but how Southeast Asia perceive each countries, and I'm talking particularly about US and China, how US and China have responded to the COVID, that will also determine their strategic choices going to the future. So I'll stop here, but happy to delve into that in the later answers.
Thank you. Let's turn to economy. Richard, how has the region economy fared, and what are your thoughts on the outlook? How hard will recovery be, and what can be done to help it?
Well, like the rest of the world, not well is the short answer to the question on the regional economy. If you're looking for a headline statistic, the most recent forecast from the Asian Development Bank suggests that the region's economy will contract by nearly 4% in 2020. And of the 10 ASEAN states, only Brunei, Vietnam, and Myanmar are likely to end the year in positive territory. And of course, that headline statistic really masks a lot of very real and serious human pain. And the region was hammered really hard in the first half of the year, especially in the second quarter, where we saw some really eye-watering declines in economic growth in most of the major Southeast Asian economies contracting by 16, 17%, for example. And really everything was just running against the region at that point, not least because of its very deep integration into East Asian supply chains and also to global markets more broadly. So it was a perfect storm. China was in hard lockdown, so inputs for manufacturing in Southeast Asia, and many factories rely very heavily on China for inputs into products that they then make and ship back to the rest of the world or back into China. So those inputs dried up and factories slowed or stopped entirely. And then global and domestic demand for Southeast Asian goods and services collapsed. And really the final nail in the coffin was the closure of international borders and domestic lockdowns that really brutally shut down the region's booming tourism economy. And the consequences of all that are very significant. Enormous lost economic growth, unemployment, businesses that will never reopen, a rise in poverty, for example. I think all eyes now are on the third quarter results to see if there's going to be at least a slowing in the rate of decline.
Thanks, Richard. Just moving a slightly different direction, is looking at the future of the region. To Professor Pan, the United Nations talks about smart containment strategies to allow countries that have controlled the pandemic to gradually open. What kind of ongoing public health measures will we need to see in Southeast Asia, and what does the new normal look like for the region?
Well, I think you need to pay attention to both the technical dimensions of this, and the mantra of continued testing, tracing, treatment of severe cases. So those are the 3 T's from a technical perspective. From a public health perspective, there's a lot of excitement about vaccines, but personally, I do not believe that the vaccine alone is going to end the pandemic. As it is at the moment, we don't even have one. Okay, so we need to pay attention to the 3 W's of public health, which is wear your mask, wash your hands frequently, and watch your distance. So, those 3 go hand in hand with any potential vaccines that might come along in the future, as well as maintaining your technical capacity to test, to trace, and to treat. So those are, I believe, what is going to constitute an effective containment package in the future.
Thank you. And going back to geopolitics, Huong, we often hear from our Southeast Asia colleagues and partners that they're confident that they can manage the US-China competition because they had a long experience of living with powerful China and managing great power rivalry. Of course, the competition between the US and China is much sharper now, and that we see in the past couple of years. How confident are you in the ability of the region to continue to hedge and continue to balance its interest between 2 major powers?
I think the instinct in Southeast Asia would be continue to hedge. How they do it, though, will be different from the previous experiences. There's a lot of discussion on drawing from historical experience of great power competition that Southeast Asia have experienced it before, and that Southeast Asia has always lived in betwixt the great powers. But as you said, this time it's quite different. It's very complex. It's penetrating all aspects, and it's in much more advanced way compared to the previous cases. And I think there are a great deal of concern about the great power competition and the nature of intensifying competition in Southeast Asia as well, despite the fact that there is some confidence in a way of dealing with them. I think Singapore, for example, as well as others, have voiced how uncomfortable they are becoming with this, at least in the rhetorical sense, of great power competition between the US and China, but also in real terms, as we've had before the COVID, which is the trade war and tariff war, which really affect all Southeast Asian countries, including the supply chain Richard alluded to earlier. So I think there's a mixture of those who are confident in a way that, okay, this is persisting. There is great power competition. We've dealt with that before. We have to learn from the previous experience. We don't want to take sides and make choices as we had before during the Cold War. But also, I think there is a concern, not across all countries in Southeast Asia, not in equal terms. Some are more strategically astute and more alerted to the issue, and some are less. But I think overall there is less of, and with exception, I'm saying that there's a less sense of urgency in a way that associated with China's rise in China's threat, because for Southeast Asia, China's rise and China's threat had been there for a long, long time. What is new for Southeast Asia is how US is treating China at the moment. So that needs a certain adjustment. And as you said, we are really in the juncture of big changes coming along. And I'm alluding to the November election in US as well, which will change quite a bit of equation. How Southeast Asia hedge will depend also on what are the options, whether US is willing to put up, viable and feasible options for Southeast Asia, because quite a number of Southeast Asians tend to doubt that at this moment in time. So how they hedge, what choices they make, also depend on what options they have coming from external powers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Richard, do you agree with that assessment? And also sort of quick follow-up question on that, I guess the role of the US elections and the sort of the future of US policy in Asia, how will that have an impact on Southeast Asian calculation, but also the capacity to manage the great power competition?
Yeah, I think Huong has covered it well. I do think this American election is going to be very significant, and of course it's globally significant, but Southeast Asian governments are watching the result very carefully. If you look at what Southeast Asian leaders and commentators have been saying, as Huang said, they're determined not to be forced into a position where they have to choose between one or the other of the great powers. And I think even more so, the way in which the Trump administration frames its contest with China, that is increasingly in ideological terms, where you hear the Secretary of State saying that what we really face is a choice between authoritarian vision for the future and a free and democratic one. That really turns Southeast Asian leaders off. They're just not interested in that kind of framing. And in other ways, the Trump administration has tried to do more in Southeast Asia, but in other ways, the president or even the Secretary of State doesn't turn up to the key ASEAN events. So my guess is that the region, if there is to be a change of administration, would be looking for a change in tone. They want America to value Southeast Asia in its own right, not just because of major power competition. Now, one caveat to all that: it's a big region. Views about America and the Trump administration are diverse, and there are at least some countries, I think I'd put Vietnam in this, who, while they might find the Trump administration hard to handle, don't want America to step back from a competitive relationship with China, from pushing back against Chinese behavior that affects others' national interest. And there's a little bit of doubt about the Biden administration's potential Asia credentials, and you occasionally see a few grizzly Southeast Asian commentators like Bilahari Kausikan weighing in on this and making these points.
Thanks, Richard. And just staying with you, you touched on that a little bit in the previous answer, but you've written for this project that COVID is entrenching a pre-existing trend of democratic regression and illiberalism in Southeast Asia. And how is this manifesting itself in your observation? And what can be done about this trend? And can international partners make any difference?
Yeah, thanks, Philip. Look, it's a big, diverse region, as we were just discussing. So the story across the region, of course, is not uniform, because there are a variety of forms of government in Southeast Asia. But just for the sake of brevity, I think you can see this trend in a number of ways. The first and most significant one is really quite significantly expanded executive powers. Now, these usually or mostly come in the form of declarations of states of emergency of one sort or another. And they're not per se bad things. In part, they're designed to give Southeast Asian governments the ability to mobilise all aspects of national resources to fight the pandemic. But the problem with them is that for illiberal or autocratic governments, they're another way of stifling political opposition, closing down space for civil society, and attacking free media. And certainly we're seeing plenty of examples of that type of behaviour. Another manifestation is in a couple of countries, notably the Philippines, but also Indonesia to some extent. We've seen the military out leading the response to the pandemic, and that hasn't been all that effective. It's tended to boost military influence at the expense of civilian administrations or civilian institutions. And certainly in the case of the Philippines, it's led to human rights abuses, or what the United Nations has called in a rather memorable phrase, toxic lockdown culture. We've seen other manifestations of this illiberalism, intolerance of ethnic minorities and also of migrant labour, for example. We've had some elections that have been postponed, notably the big local national elections in Indonesia. And elsewhere, elections which are hard enough for some countries in Southeast Asia to manage at the best of times, are even harder in a pandemic. And of course, the very important national election that we have coming up in Myanmar is an example. And some of the problems of running an election in time of a pandemic are likely to lead to more disputed or contested outcomes. Mm. Look, you noted already that democratic regression is a pre-existing trend in Southeast Asia. So this is not a dramatic shift of direction, but it simply comes on top of it, entrenches or reinforces that pre-existing trend. It's really hard for international partners to shift this. Indeed, of course, it's really hard for citizens inside Southeast Asian nations themselves to create durable change. And that's for pretty simple reasons. Southeast Asian governments usually have their hands pretty firmly on all the levers of control, and there are a few checks and balances in most of their systems. And look, we might hope, for example, that the student protests in Thailand, amazing as they are at the moment, quite extraordinary to watch, could prove an exception, but it's hard to be very confident about that. I think it's also true, as we say in the paper on this, that many of Southeast Asia's external partners in the West don't want to bring too much pressure to bear on these issues for fear of losing influence inside Southeast Asia at a time when China's power in the region is growing. Even so, I think, the space is obviously narrow, but I don't think personally it's a binary choice between doing absolutely nothing or rupturing important bilateral ties. And I think with clever and creative and confident diplomacy, there's still room for Western partners to promote their values and advocate for change without shutting the door on closer cooperation. We don't have time to go through how they might do this, but the paper on the website offers a few thoughts, and they include things like calling out illiberal behaviour, more targeted sanctions, asylum for human rights defenders or political advocates whose lives might be threatened, and making sure, and this is a really important one, that even though aid in the region has to be re-geared to meet urgent COVID priorities, wherever possible, this shouldn't come at the expense of programs that are very important in the region that go to long-term support for civil society and the building of effective and accountable institutions, trying to tackle corruption and to help Southeast Asian democracies the fledgling ones, the fragile ones, to put on credible elections.
Mm. Thanks, Richard. And to Professor Pan, just staying on the question of partnerships. Well, first of all, what lessons has the region learned over the past year? And how do you assess the level of collaboration within the region, especially on the public health issues, but also in terms of external partnerships, whether it's with United States or with international organizations, Japan or Australia for that matter? How can external partners best help the region, and where do you think the collaboration is possible in this environment?
Okay, thank you, Philip. On your first question about lessons learned, I think my view of this can be summarized in the acronym SAR: speed, anticipation, and preparation. And Vietnam is probably one of the best examples here. They acted very quickly, strongly, with lots of testing capacity, and they were able to anticipate potential outbreaks. In terms of the three key lessons learned, this was summarized very nicely by Vivian Balakrishnan, Singapore's foreign minister, who said that it relies on three arms of a tripod: good governance, good healthcare system, and social capital. That third one we haven't really touched upon, and that refers to populations in many countries in Southeast Asia compared to, say, Western democracies that Richard alluded to, where populations, I think, have a higher capability to accept social responsibility, to place the health of the community ahead of the health of individuals. So social capital, healthcare, and good governance. These are the three key lessons. Turning to your question on international cooperation, obviously, in terms of my view, it comes very much from a multilateral perspective. I worked for the WHO for many, many years, 13 years here in Geneva. And I think the contribution of external partners in sort of a neutral context of a multilateral body like the WHO is to set standards and guidelines like the international health regulations, which guides all countries in pandemic response. Secondly, their role in sharing information as a clearinghouse of reliable and timely data. And also promoting sort of the sharing of even commodities between countries, acting as a neutral promoter in that regard. And finally, of course, as many of you are aware, to actually play a more active role in accelerating the development of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. You may know about something called the ACT Accelerator, and in the context of vaccines is an initiative called COVAX, which focuses on making vaccines available and distribution and even financial support to the tune of around $12 billion. This is led by the World Bank, Gavi, and WHO. But at the end of the day, it's working with governments, not sort of having a top-down directive kind of approach. And I should, of course, obviously mention the role of ASEAN in all of this at the regional level in Southeast Asia. You may remember in April, a high-level special summit of the heads of state on coordinated response towards COVID. ASEAN already has in place sharing of epidemiological surveillance data, and hopefully, although I've not seen anything really concrete in this regard, I don't know, Huong and Richard may know better, I have not seen anything concrete at the lower levels of how this a high-level commitment is actually translating into activities on the ground. But clearly, ASEAN, perhaps together with the WHO regional offices in Manila, for example, for the Western Pacific region, and in Delhi, which includes Indonesia, for example, I think those regional organizations will play a very important role.
Thank you. You kind of answered the question that just came from the audience about the ASEAN summit in November, and what are you anticipating in terms of strategy and policy coming out of the summit in terms of the comprehensive recovery response? I might just ask, do you have expectations, or do you have visibility of what's being prepared for the November summit? Tikki?
No, I don't have any sort of recent information on that, but clearly I think the seriousness of the situation in Indonesia, Philippines, and Myanmar will really, I think, put a lot of emphasis on the need for solidarity and cooperation, sharing knowledge, sharing resources, technical support between countries. So I'm hoping that it will translate into really tangible, practical, sort of bilateral or multilateral arrangements coordinated by ASEAN. But having said that, I'm a little bit of a not being particularly enthusiastic about the role of ASEAN in the past, particularly with regards to the health sector. Okay, as you know, compared to the World Bank or the ADB, it is not very well resourced. So I'm hoping that with this crisis, it's an opportunity for ASEAN to step forward more and perhaps mobilize more resources from its member states to tackle this problem.
Thank you. Richard, what's your expectation, particularly on the economic plan for the November summit?
Yeah, look, I think we'll have to see, but if you look at what ASEAN's been doing in the meantime, I suspect it will draw in a number of strands and initiatives, some of which, and themes, some of which have already been announced. So, for example, ASEAN is setting up what they called a regional response fund to help procure medical equipment and supplies. And a number of countries, including Australia, have already contributed to that. They're setting up a regional medical supplies reserve. There's also been a strong emphasis from leaders already about keeping trade open. So what they want is essential goods like food, medicine, medical equipment, for example, to continue to flow freely. There's been concern about vaccine nationalism. I think there'll be a strong emphasis on regional economic integration, both within ASEAN, but between ASEAN and the rest of the region. There's a very strong sense of ASEAN, wanting to double down on that. And there seems to be quite a lot of hope that the long negotiated regional comprehensive economic partnership agreement, this is another big free trade agreement between ASEAN and those countries that have free trade agreements with ASEAN. India, of course, is a notable exception now, having left the negotiations. Some degree of hope that big agreement will be signed. So I think they're some of the themes that I think you'll see run through the plan, along with, I think, an encapsulation of previous commitments and interest in boosting things like the digital economy and new manufacturing.
Thanks, Richard. You touched on a question of personal protective equipment, and then now, of course, the vaccine. I want to ask Huong about them being used as tools of diplomacy during this year. China has been very active with face mask diplomacy. Now it's vaccine diplomacy. How much traction is this giving China in the region? And what would your advice be for the new US administration when thinking about shoring up its influence in Southeast Asia?
Well, in the beginning, I think quite early on, after China sort of come back to its feet, it rolled out, mass diplomacy, came to ASEAN meetings on the pandemics. It came to certain Southeast Asian countries, so it wasn't across the board, was certainly more popular, for example, in Malaysia, Indonesia, or Philippines than, for example, Vietnam, for that matter, or Singapore with this mass diplomacy. So it's very unequal in terms of how China engage with the region. I think the effect will be also quite varied. Some would claim that it's well received. Others they are a little bit more comprehensive about what does that mean. But I wouldn't pay too much attention to the mass diplomacy, because there are so many that are engaging, that Taiwan is engaging in the mass diplomacy. Vietnam is actually engaging in mass diplomacy, and it is sending to US and Europe for that matter. So that rather, that on the receiving end, it is actually on the giving end. And to your question about the US, I think, first of all, I think the whole region, probably the whole world, was really shocked by how the pandemic affected and is still affecting the US, and that was not expected. And obviously that will have implications on how the US is being perceived in the region. It was by some seen as a wasted opportunity to show leadership. Also wasted opportunity to show, governance capability, like Professor Pang mentioned. It's the tripod, and governance was essentially not in a good shape at that tripod. US has comparatively with many countries in the world, and including in Southeast Asia, much better public health. Like in that tripod. We can talk about the social capital, but essentially the governance failed in the eyes of many Southeast Asians, and that will affect how they perceive a US leadership in the region. In terms of how Southeast Asia would want, post-November US engage, I think in many ways, I think to start with, it's to really deliver on what US has been saying, which is, partnership for good, quality, whatever, quality infrastructure, quality governance, all those, contributing to the region rather than being in the region for the sake of competition with China only. So beyond the nervousness about US-China competition, there's also a next level of nervousness, which is Southeast Asians are now worried that if US is not able to get from Southeast Asia what it wants, which is, supporting US in countering China, then it won't be interested in the regions. And so that is the biggest fear at the moment. So hopefully post-November in the US, in the Washington, the adjustment in the Asia policy will include that. It will consider that Southeast Asia is interested by all means in US presence in the region, but not only through the lenses of competition with China.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but I want to ask a question about Australia, given we are Asia Society Australia. And Richard, what's your, assessment of Australia's relationship with Southeast Asia in 2020, particularly in the response to the pandemic, both the health response and the economic response? And also, what would you like to see us doing more with Southeast Asia going forward to help it recover?
Yeah, look, I think the current state of our relations with Southeast Asia is very strong, and the current government has been building on foundations that successive Australian governments have been laying for many, many years, but doing it with a great deal of energy and enthusiasm, whether that's on political relationships or on the economic relationships, or indeed on our defence and security cooperation. And Australia has responded to the humanitarian and economic crisis of the pandemic in Southeast Asia. We've re-geared our Southeast Asia aid program to focus on COVID pandemics. We've had a very strong focus on vaccines, including by making an important contribution to the what's called the COVAX Advanced Facility, which is a multilateral effort to ensure that developing countries can get access to vaccines as they come online. So I think that's always a positive story. I think absolutely we can do more. You can always do more. And I think that we have two reasons to do it. One is a humanitarian reason to help alleviate the effects of the pandemic on poverty and on inequality in Southeast Asia. But as Huong said in one of her early answers, how Southeast Asia emerges economically from the pandemic is also going to be an important factor in its future and in its ability to manage this period of heightened geopolitical competition and much sharper US-China tension. So an economically stronger Southeast Asia is going to be more independent and more resilient, and that's also in its long-term interests.
Thank you, Richard. I think we can finish on that positive note. Thank you very much to you, to Tikki and Huong for this very insightful update. And also thank you, of course, to for your contributions to the project. A very special thank you to the supporters of this initiative, to Australia-ASEAN Council, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Victorian government for supporting this project and Asia Society. And of course, finally, thank you to all our viewers and listeners for joining us. This event has been recorded and you can view it on Asia Society's global YouTube channel. And of course, please read the essays. There will be more published in the weeks ahead with additional expert commentaries and videos, particularly on trade and economy, which will be very important. And thank you all for tuning in today. Have a good evening.